It was a bright, sunny Saturday morning. The kind of day where you wake up, stretch, and feel good about everything. Jake Miller was just a regular guy living in a small house on a quiet street. He had big plans for the weekend, nothing fancy, just stuff he liked. You know, mow the lawn so it looked nice and green. Then maybe grab a cold soda from the fridge, kick back on his old couch, and watch some TV shows all day. Simple stuff, right? That's what Jake thought, too. He had no idea that this sunny day was about to turn into a giant mess. A mess so big it would feel like a war zone right outside his front door. Now, here's the thing you need to know, Jake's little street was usually super calm. Kids rode bikes, dogs barked a little, and neighbors waved hello. But there was one person who made everything not so calm. Her name? Well, everyone called her HOA Karen. She wasn't really named Karen, but that's what people said because she acted like one of those bossy people you hear about. HOA stands for Homeowners Association. It's like a club that makes rules for the neighborhood. And Karen? She loved being in charge of it. She walked around like she owned every house, every tree, every blade of grass. Picture this, she'd march up and down the street with a clipboard in her hand, her nose stuck up in the air, yelling at people about dumb stuff. "Your mailbox is too rusty," she'd shout. Or, "Your flowers are too tall." Most people didn't like her much. They'd just roll their eyes, shake their heads, and go back inside. Jake was one of those people. He didn't care about Karen's silly rules. He kept to himself, did his own thing, and stayed out of trouble. His house wasn't big or fancy, but it was his. He had a little porch with a squeaky rocking chair, a patchy lawn that needed some love, and an old pickup truck parked in the driveway. That truck wasn't shiny or new, it had dents and scratches, but Jake liked it. It got him to his job at the hardware store every day, and that's all he needed. Life was good for Jake. Simple and good. At least, that's what he thought on this sunny Saturday morning. But here's the sneaky part: something was about to change. Jake didn't know it yet, but his quiet little world was about to get flipped upside down. And guess who was behind it? Yep, HOA Karen. She wasn't just walking around with her clipboard today. Oh no, she had a plan. A mean, sneaky plan that was going to make Jake so mad he'd want to yell. But here's the fun part: Karen didn't know she was about to pick a fight with the wrong guy. Jake might look like just a regular dude with a scruffy beard and a beat-up truck, but he had a trick or two hidden up his sleeve. Curious yet? Good. Stick with me, because this story is about to get wild. Let's paint the picture a little more so you can really see it. Imagine Jake waking up that morning. The sun was shining through his window, making little stripes of light on his messy bedroom floor. He yawned, rubbed his eyes, and scratched his head. His brown hair stuck up in funny directions, but he didn't care. He pulled on an old t-shirt, the one with a hole near the sleeve, and some jeans that were a little faded. Then he shuffled to the kitchen, his socks sliding on the wood floor. He grabbed a bowl, poured some cereal, and splashed milk on it. Crunch, crunch, crunch. He ate it fast, standing by the counter, looking out the window. Outside, birds were chirping, and a squirrel ran across his yard. Everything seemed perfect. Normal. Happy. Jake finished his cereal and thought about his day. Okay, he said to himself, first I'll mow the lawn. It's getting kinda long, and I don't want the neighbors complaining. He smirked a little, thinking about HOA Karen. She'd probably measure the grass with a ruler if she could. Then, he went on, I'll grab a soda, maybe the orange kind, and sit on the couch. There's that show about fixing old cars I've been wanting to watch. Yeah, that sounds good. He nodded, happy with his plan. It wasn't a big, exciting weekend, but it was his. And that's what mattered to Jake, keeping things easy and chill. He rinsed his cereal bowl and set it in the sink. Then he walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped onto his porch. The air smelled like fresh grass and warm sunshine. He took a big breath and smiled. Nice day, he mumbled. He looked around his little street. There was Mr. Thompson across the road, watering his roses. Down the way, two kids were riding scooters, laughing and yelling. And Jake's truck sat there in the driveway, just where he'd left it last night. Everything was in its place. Or so he thought. Now, let's talk about HOA Karen for a minute. She wasn't like the other neighbors. Mr. Thompson was nice, he'd wave and say hi. The kids were loud but fun. Even Mrs. Lopez, who lived next door, would sometimes bring Jake cookies just because. But Karen? She was different. She didn't wave or smile. She didn't bring cookies. She brought trouble. Every day, she'd walk around with that clipboard, writing stuff down like she was a detective or something. She wore these big sunglasses that made her look like a bug, and her hair was always pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt. Her voice was loud, super loud, and she loved telling people what to do. Like one time, she told Mr. Thompson his roses were too red. Too red? Can you believe that? Mr. Thompson just laughed and kept watering them. Another time, she told Mrs. Lopez her dog barked too much. Mrs. Lopez said, "He's a dog, Karen. That's what dogs do." But Karen didn't care. She wrote it down on her clipboard and stomped off. Everyone knew she was a little crazy, but they let her do her thing because fighting with her was too much work. Jake had seen all this. He'd watched Karen boss people around for months. Most of the time, he stayed out of it. She'd come to his house once or twice, knocking on his door, complaining about his truck. "It's ugly," she'd say. "It makes the neighborhood look bad." Jake would just nod, say, "Okay, Karen," and shut the door. He didn't want a fight. He figured she'd get bored and leave him alone eventually. But deep down, he was starting to get annoyed. Every time she yelled at him, he'd feel a little spark of mad inside. Not big mad, not yet, but just enough to make him wonder how long he could keep ignoring her. Back to that Saturday morning. Jake grabbed his sneakers from the porch and sat down in his rocking chair to put them on. The chair creaked as he rocked back and forth, tying his laces. He glanced at his truck again. It wasn't pretty, sure. The blue paint was chipped, and one of the tires looked a little flat. But it was his truck. He'd bought it with his own money, fixed it up when it broke, and drove it everywhere. To him, it wasn't just a truck, it was like a friend. Karen could call it ugly all she wanted, but Jake didn't care. At least, he didn't think he cared. Not until today. So there he was, sitting on his porch, ready to start his day. The sun was climbing higher, the birds were still singing, and the street was peaceful. Jake stood up, stretched his arms, and walked toward the shed to get his lawnmower. He hummed a little song, feeling good. "Gonna be a great day," he said to himself. He had no idea, no clue at all that HOA Karen was already up to something. Something mean. Something sneaky. Something that was going to turn his great day into a giant headache. Here's where it gets exciting. While Jake was planning his lawn mowing and TV watching, Karen was planning, too. She'd woken up early, way before Jake put on her big sunglasses, grabbed her clipboard, and started walking the street. She looked at every house, every yard, every car. And when she got to Jake's place, she stopped. She stared at his truck for a long time, her lips pressed tight together. "That thing," she muttered. "That ugly, rusty thing. It's got to go." She wrote something on her clipboard, nodded to herself, and walked away. But she didn't just walk away to forget about it. Oh no. She had a plan, a big, bad plan. And Jake? He was about to walk right into it without even knowing. What was her plan? Well, I won't tell you everything yet, that'd ruin the fun. But let's just say Karen wasn't going to knock on Jake's door this time. She wasn't going to yell or wave her clipboard around. Nope, she was going to do something way worse. Something that would make Jake's jaw drop and his fists clench. And the best part? She thought she'd get away with it. She thought Jake was just some quiet guy who wouldn't fight back. Boy, was she wrong. So picture this, Jake, happy and clueless, heading to his shed. Karen, sneaky and bossy, plotting trouble. The sun shining, the street quiet, and a big storm brewing that no one could see yet. That's where our story starts. A regular day about to turn into something crazy. And trust me, you're gonna want to hear what happens next. Because Jake? He's not just any guy. And Karen? She's about to learn that the hard way. Oh, and before we keep going, I've got a little question for you. Where are you watching from today? Are you at home, at school, maybe outside somewhere? Drop it in the comments, I'd love to know. And if you like stories like this, ones with sneaky twists and funny fights, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. Things are about to get super juicy, and you won't want to miss it. Jake loved his truck. It was old, sure, and it wasn't shiny or pretty like some cars. The blue paint was chipped, and there were little dents on the side from when he'd bumped it a couple of years ago. But to Jake, that truck was special. He parked it in his driveway every night, right outside his little house, just like always. It wasn't fancy, but it was his. He'd saved up his money from his job at the hardware store to buy it. That truck got him to work every day, rattling down the road with its noisy engine. It wasn't quiet, and it wasn't new, but Jake didn't care. It worked, and that's what mattered to him. But there was one person who didn't like that truck at all. Her name was HOA Karen. You remember her, right? The lady with the clipboard who acted like she owned the whole neighborhood. She'd been bossing people around for months, telling them what to do with their houses and yards. And Jake's truck? Oh, she hated it more than anything. Every time she walked by his house, she'd stop and stare at it. Her nose would scrunch up like she smelled something bad, and her eyes would get all narrow behind those big sunglasses she always wore. "It's an eyesore," she'd yell, loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. Her voice was so sharp it could cut through anything, glass, wood, even Jake's patience. She didn't just yell from the street, though. Nope, Karen would march right up to Jake's porch, her shoes stomping on the ground like she was in a big hurry. She'd bang on his door, bam, 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 so hard the whole house shook a little. Jake would open it, still in his socks sometimes, and there she'd be, clipboard in hand, glaring at him. "You need to fix that truck," she'd demand. "It's ugly. It makes the neighborhood look bad. Hide it in the garage or get rid of it." Jake didn't have a garage, and he wasn't about to get rid of his truck. But he didn't argue. He'd just smile a little smile, not a big one, nod his head, and say, "Sure, Karen." Then he'd close the door, nice and slow, while she stood there huffing and puffing. Jake figured she'd get tired of it someday. You know how some people nag and nag, but then they give up? That's what he hoped. He didn't like fighting, and he didn't want trouble. He just wanted to live his life, mow his lawn, and drive his truck to work. So every time Karen came knocking, he'd say the same thing, "Sure, Karen." Then he'd go back inside, sit on his couch, and forget about her. Spoiler alert, she didn't get tired. Not even a little bit. She kept coming back, over and over, like a fly that won't leave you alone. And each time, Jake's smile got a tiny bit smaller, and that spark of mad inside him got a tiny bit bigger. This went on for months. Spring turned to summer, and summer turned to fall. The leaves on the trees went from green to orange, and Jake's truck stayed right where it was in his driveway. Karen kept yelling, kept knocking, kept writing stuff on her clipboard. Sometimes Jake would peek out his window and see her standing there, staring at the truck like it was the worst thing she'd ever seen. He'd laugh to himself and think, "It's just a truck, Karen. Relax." But she couldn't relax. To her, that truck was a big problem, and she was going to fix it, no matter what. One Friday night, Jake came home from work extra tired. He'd been lifting heavy boxes at the hardware store all day, and his arms felt like spaghetti. He parked his truck in the driveway, same as always, and dragged himself inside. He kicked off his sneakers, grabbed a soda from the fridge, and flopped onto the couch. The TV flickered on, and he watched some show about fishing until his eyes got heavy. Tomorrow's Saturday, he mumbled to himself. No work. Just a chill day. He smiled, thinking about sleeping in, maybe making pancakes, and mowing the lawn if he felt like it. With that happy thought, he turned off the TV, shuffled to his bedroom, and fell asleep. Now, here's where things start to get crazy. While Jake was snoring away, dreaming about pancakes, something was happening outside. The street was dark and quiet. The moon was up, shining on the houses, and everything seemed peaceful. But then, out of the shadows, came Hoa Karen. She wasn't loud this time. She wasn't yelling or banging on doors. She was sneaky. She tiptoed down the street, her clipboard under her arm, looking around like she didn't want anyone to see her. She stopped right in front of Jake's house and stared at his truck again. "Enough is enough," she whispered to herself. "This ends now." What did she do? Well, she didn't knock on Jake's door this time. She didn't leave a note or shout about rules. Nope, she did something much worse. She pulled out her phone, dialed a number, and waited. A big tow truck rolled up a little while later, quiet as it could be, but still noisy enough to wake up Mrs. Lopez's dog down the street. The dog barked once, then went quiet. Jake didn't hear a thing, he was fast asleep. The tow truck driver hooked up Jake's pickup, the chains clinking softly, and then just like that the truck was gone. Hauled away into the night. Karen watched it go, a big grin on her face. Finally, she said. The neighborhood looks better already. She taped a little note to Jake's mailbox, turned around, and walked home, feeling like she'd won. The next morning, Jake woke up to silence. No birds chirping yet, no kids playing outside, just quiet. He stretched, yawned, and rubbed his eyes. Something felt off. He couldn't figure out what it was at first. He got out of bed, pulled on his jeans and that same old t-shirt with the hole in it, and shuffled to the kitchen. He poured some cereal, ate it fast, and looked out the window while he chewed. That's when it hit him. His truck, it wasn't there. The driveway was empty. No chipped blue paint, no dents, no nothing. Just bare concrete staring back at him. Bam. That's what went through Jake's head like a big shock exploding in his brain. He dropped his spoon into the bowl with a clatter and ran to the window. He pressed his nose against the glass, squinting to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Nope, still empty. Where's my truck? He said out loud, his voice all scratchy from just waking up. He grabbed his sneakers, didn't even bother tying them, and bolted outside. The morning air was cool, and the grass was wet with dew under his feet. He stood in the driveway, staring at the spot where his truck should have been. Gone. Vanished. Like it had never been there at all. That's when he saw it, the note. A little piece of paper taped to his mailbox, flapping in the breeze. He yanked it off and read it fast. Vehicle towed per HOA rules. Contact Karen. That's all it said. No sorry, no explanation, just those words in her neat, bossy handwriting. Jake's hands shook as he held the paper. His face got hot, and his heart started thumping loud in his chest. She didn't, he whispered. She couldn't have. But she did. HOA Karen had towed his truck, from his own driveway. Jake's blood started boiling. You know that feeling when you're so mad you can feel it in your whole body? Like your ears get warm and your fists clench up all by themselves? That's how Jake felt. He crumpled the note in his hand, squeezing it into a tiny ball. Oh, she's done it now, he said through his teeth. He wasn't just annoyed anymore. He wasn't just a little mad. He was furious. Karen had crossed a line, a big, fat line, and Jake wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. But here's the cool part, the part that makes the story awesome. Jake wasn't just mad. Oh no, he had something else going on. A little secret up his sleeve that Karen didn't know about. See, Jake wasn't just some quiet guy who let people walk all over him. He'd been watching, waiting, and keeping track of things. All those times Karen yelled at him. All those knocks on his door? He hadn't forgotten. And now, with his truck gone, he was ready to do something about it. Something big. Something that would make Karen wish she'd never messed with him. What was his secret? Can you guess? Don't worry if you can't, I'm not telling you yet. That's the fun of this story. You've got to keep watching to find out. But I'll give you a tiny hint, Jake wasn't as helpless as Karen thought. He had a plan, and it was going to turn this whole mess upside down. She thought she'd won by towing his truck, but she didn't see what was coming. Not even a little bit. So there Jake stood, in his driveway, the crumpled note in his fist, his sneakers untied, and his heart pounding. The street was still quiet, but inside Jake, a storm was brewing. He looked toward Karen's house down the road, her perfect little yard with its perfect little flowers. Okay, Karen, he said under his breath. You want to play? Let's play. And with that, he turned back to his house, ready to fight back in a way she'd never expect. What do you think Jake's going to do? How's he going to get even? Stick around, because this is just the beginning. Things are about to get wild, and you won't want to miss it. Jake stomped back into his house, his untied sneakers flapping against the porch steps. The door slammed behind him, bang, louder than he meant it to. He was still holding that crumpled note in his hand, and every time he looked at it, he got madder. Vehicle towed per HOA rules. Contact Karen. Those words burned in his brain like a hot stove. He tossed the note onto the kitchen counter and paced back and forth, his socks sliding a little on the floor. She towed my truck, he kept saying, over and over. My truck. From my driveway. Who does that? He stopped pacing and leaned against the counter, breathing hard. His cereal bowl was still sitting there, half-eaten, the milk all soggy now. He didn't care about breakfast anymore. All he could think about was his truck, his beat-up, trusty truck gone. Taken away in the middle of the night like some sneaky thief had snatched it. And it wasn't a thief. It was Karen. HOA Karen, with her clipboard and her rules and that smirk she always wore. Jake's fists clenched tighter. He wanted to yell. He wanted to run to her house and bang on her door, just like she always did to him. But he didn't. Not yet. See, Jake was mad, super mad, but he wasn't dumb. He knew yelling at Karen wouldn't fix this. She'd just stand there, all smug, waving her stupid rulebook in his face. It's in the rules, Jake, she'd say. You can't do anything about it. And that's what made him the maddest. She thought she could do whatever she wanted, and no one would stop her. She thought Jake was just some quiet guy who'd take it and say, sure, Karen, like always. But not this time. Oh no. This time, she'd gone too far, and Jake wasn't going to let it slide. He took a deep breath and ran his hands through his messy hair. Okay, he said to himself, trying to calm down. Think, Jake. Think. He looked out the window again, at the empty driveway. The sun was higher now, shining bright, making the wet grass sparkle. It should have been a nice day. A chill day. But Karen had ruined it. He shook his head and muttered, she's not getting away with this. That's when the little spark of mad inside him turned into a big fire. Not just mad, determined. He was going to fight back. And he had a secret weapon. Something Karen didn't know about. Something that was going to make her sorry she ever touched his truck. Let's rewind a bit so you can see how this all started building up. Jake had lived on that street for 2 years. 2 whole years. And for most of that time, things were fine. The neighbors were nice, the street was quiet, and Jake kept to himself. He'd mow his lawn, wave to Mr. Thompson across the road, and sometimes chat with Mrs. Lopez about her dog. Life was easy. Then Karen showed up. Not moved in, she'd lived there forever, but she got picked as the HOA president last year. That's when everything changed. Before Karen, the HOA was just a boring thing nobody cared about. They'd send a letter once in a while, like, hey, trim your bushes, and that was it. But when Karen took over, oh boy. She turned it into her own little kingdom. She started walking around with that clipboard, making rules about everything. No toys in the yard, she'd say. No loud music. Your trash cans can't be out past 7 a.m. People didn't like it, but they didn't fight her. They'd grumble, roll their eyes, and do what she said just to shut her up. Jake was the same way at first. The truck thing started a few months ago. One day, Karen knocked on his door, bam, 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 and pointed at his pickup. That thing's an eyesore, she said, her voice all sharp and mean. It's rusty. It's old. It doesn't belong here. Jake stood there, still in his work clothes, paint splattered on his jeans from a project at the store. He scratched his head and said, it's my truck, Karen. It's fine. But she didn't listen. She wrote something on her clipboard and stormed off. Jake thought that was the end of it. Nope. She came back the next week. And the week after that. Every time, it was the same, fix it. Hide it. Get rid of it. And every time, Jake smiled, said, sure, Karen, and shut the door. But here's the thing, he wasn't just ignoring her. He was watching. Listening. Every time she yelled, he remembered it. Every time she banged on his door, he noticed. He even started keeping a little notebook, not a fancy one, just an old one he had from work. He'd write stuff down late at night, after she'd gone. May 10, Karen said truck is rusty. June 3, Karen banged on door, yelled about eyesore. Little notes like that. He didn't know why he was doing it at first. It just felt smart. Like maybe one day, he'd need it. And now, with his truck gone, that day had come. Back to that morning. Jake grabbed the crumpled note off the counter and smoothed it out. He read it again, vehicle towed per HOA rules. Contact Karen. He snorted, a little laugh that wasn't happy. Contact Karen? Oh, I'll contact her, all right. He tossed the note back down and started pacing again. His mind was racing now, full of ideas. He could go to her house and yell. He could call the tow company and demand his truck back. He could tell the neighbors what she'd done and get them mad, too. But none of that felt right. Not yet. He needed something better. Something that would hit Karen where it hurt. That's when he remembered his secret. His little trick up his sleeve. See, Jake wasn't just some guy with a truck. He was smart. Quiet, yeah, but smart. All those months of Karen bossing people around. He'd been paying attention. Not just to her yelling at him, but to everything. He'd heard Mr. Thompson complain about her fining him for his roses. He'd seen Mrs. Lopez shake her head when Karen rode her up for her dog barking. He'd even noticed stuff about Karen's own house, like how her fancy SUV was always parked wrong, taking up 2 spots, which was against her own rules. Jake had it all written down in that notebook, tucked away in a drawer. He stopped pacing and grinned. It wasn't a big grin, just a little one, like he'd figured something out. She thinks she's so perfect, he said to himself. She thinks she can do anything. But she's not perfect. And I've got proof. He ran to his bedroom, yanked open the drawer by his bed, and pulled out the notebook. It was small, with a scratched-up cover, but inside was gold. Pages and pages of Karen's nonsense, all in his messy handwriting. Dates, times, what she said, what she did. He flipped through it, his grin getting bigger. Oh, Karen, he said. You messed with the wrong guy. But that wasn't all. Jake had one more thing, something even better. He'd been talking to a buddy at work, a guy named Tom who knew stuff about rules and laws. Tom had told him once, HOAs can't just do whatever they want. They've got bylaws, big rules they have to follow. Jake didn't know what bylaws meant back then, but he'd nodded like he did. Now, though. Now it clicked. What if Karen broke one of those big rules by towing his truck? What if she wasn't allowed to do it? His heart beat faster. He didn't know for sure, but he was going to find out. He grabbed his phone off the counter and scrolled through his contacts. There was Tom's number. He could call him, ask about those bylaws. Maybe Tom would know if Karen was wrong. Maybe Jake could use that against her. He didn't hit call yet, he wanted to think it through, but the idea made him feel strong. Like he wasn't just mad anymore. He was ready. Ready to fight back. Ready to show Karen she couldn't push him around. Jake put the phone down and looked out the window again. The empty driveway stared back at him, but this time, it didn't make him mad. It made him excited. She thinks she's won, he said, his voice low and steady. She thinks I'll just take it? But I've got something she doesn't expect. He tapped the notebook with his finger and nodded. This is war, Karen. And I'm not losing. He didn't know everything yet. He didn't know where his truck was, or how he'd get it back. But he knew one thing for sure, Karen had made a mistake. A big one. She thought Jake was weak, just some guy who'd shrug and give up. But he wasn't. He'd been quiet for too long, and now he was done. Done smiling. Done saying, sure, Karen. Done letting her win. The tension was thick now, like a storm cloud hanging over the street. Karen was probably at her house, sipping coffee, thinking she'd fix the neighborhood by getting rid of his truck. Jake was in his kitchen, notebook in hand, planning his next move. The neighbors didn't know it yet, but something big was coming. Something that would shake things up. And Jake? He was right in the middle of it, ready to turn the tables. What was his next step? How was he going to use that notebook? Was he really going to call Tom and check those bylaws? You'll have to keep watching to find out. But trust me, it's going to be good. Karen's smug little world is about to get rocked, and Jake's the one holding the hammer. Can you guess what he's planning? Stick around, this is just getting started. Jake wasn't going to sit around feeling mad. Nope, He was done with that. His truck was gone, towed away by HOA Karen, and he wasn't going to let her get away with it. He grabbed his sneakers, the ones with the untied laces, shoved them on, and stormed out the door. His fists were clenched tight, like he was ready to punch something, but he didn't. He just marched down the street, his socks still on because he forgot to change them. His heart was pounding, and his face felt hot. He was going straight to Karen's house to tell her exactly what he thought. The walk wasn't long. Karen lived just a few houses down, in a place that looked way fancier than Jake's. Her grass was always perfect, her flowers were bright, and her big SUV sat in the driveway like it owned the place. Jake didn't care about any of that right now. He stomped up her porch steps, thump, 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 and banged on her door, hard. Bam, bam, bam. He didn't knock nicely like a visitor. He knocked like he meant business. His knuckles hurt a little, but he didn't stop until he heard footsteps inside. The door swung open, and there she was, HOA Karen. She stood there with that smug grin on her face, the one that made Jake's stomach twist. Her big sunglasses were pushed up on her head, and her hair was pulled back tight, like always. In her hands, she held her precious HOA rulebook, gripping it like it was a shiny crown or a magic wand. She looked at Jake, tilted her head a little, and said, "Oh, it's you." Her voice was all smooth and fake sweet, but Jake could tell she was happy to see him mad. "What's the problem?" she asked, even though she knew exactly why he was there. Jake didn't waste a second. "You towed my truck," he said, his voice loud and shaky. He pointed a finger at her, his hand trembling from how mad he was. "My truck? From my driveway? Why'd you do that?" Karen didn't even blink. She just smiled wider, flipped open her rulebook, and pointed to a page. "You broke Rule 47B, she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "It says right here, no unsightly vehicles in the neighborhood. That truck of yours? It's ugly. Rusty. A mess. I had to get rid of it." She tapped the page with her finger and looked at him like she'd just won a game. Jake's jaw dropped. "Unsightly," he said. "It's my truck. It works fine. Who cares if it's not shiny?" He took a big, deep breath, trying to stay calm, even though he wanted to yell louder. Then he stepped closer and stared right into her eyes. "Who gave you the right to tow my truck from my own driveway?" His voice was sharp now, like a teacher asking a kid why they didn't do their homework. He wasn't backing down. Karen laughed. Not a big laugh, but a little mean one, like Jake was some silly kid asking dumb questions. "I'm the HOA president," she said, standing up straighter. "I enforce the rules. That's my job. Your truck was breaking the rules, so I had it towed. Simple as that." She shrugged, like it was no big deal, and started to close the door. "Go home, Jake. It's done." But Jake wasn't done. "Oh no." He stuck his foot in the door before it could shut, and Karen's smug grin faltered for just a second. "No," he said, his voice low and strong. "It's not done. You don't get to just take my stuff and walk away." Karen raised an eyebrow, surprised he wasn't giving up. She opened the door a little wider and crossed her arms. "What are you gonna do about it?" she asked, her tone all sassy. "Cry to the neighbors? Good luck with that." She smirked again, thinking she had him beat. "Here's where it gets good." Jake didn't yell back. He didn't stomp his feet or throw a fit. He just stood there, breathing hard, staring at her. See, Jake had been quiet for months. Months of Karen bossing everyone around, months of her banging on his door about his truck, months of her acting like she ruled the world. And all that time, he'd been watching. Listening. Paying attention. He wasn't just some guy who let things slide, he was smart. And he'd been keeping track of everything. Think about it. Karen didn't just pick on Jake. She picked on everybody. Jake had heard the whispers from the neighbors, the little complaints they didn't say too loud. Like how she fined Mr. Thompson $10 because he left his bike out one night. "It's clutter," she'd said, even though it was just a bike. Or how she told Mrs. Lopez her flowers were the wrong kind, too wild, not neat enough, and made her dig them up. Silly stuff like that. Things that didn't hurt anybody, but Karen hated them anyway. The neighbors grumbled about it, but they didn't fight her. They just paid the fines or fixed whatever she complained about, hoping she'd leave them alone. Jake, though. He didn't just grumble. He wrote it all down. Every single thing. He had this little notebook small enough to fit in his pocket where he kept a list. Every time Karen yelled at him, he'd jot it down. July 15, Karen said truck is rusty. August 2, Karen banged on door, called truck an eyesore. He wrote down what she said to the neighbors, too, when he heard it. September 10, Karen fined Mr. Thompson for bike. October 5, Karen yelled at Mrs. Lopez about flowers. He even wrote down the dates and times, just to be sure. He didn't know why he started doing it at first, it just felt like a good idea. But now it was his secret weapon. And that's not all. Jake had something else up his sleeve: pictures. Yep, he'd snapped a few with his phone when Karen wasn't looking. Like one day, he saw her perfect yard wasn't so perfect. Her big SUV was parked all crooked, taking up 2 spots in the driveway. Guess what? That was against her own HOA rules. Rule 22C said cars had to be parked neat and tidy, 1 per spot. Jake took a picture, click, and saved it. Another time, he saw her trash cans out on the curb a whole day late. Rule 19A said trash cans had to be put away by 7 a.m. the next day. Click. Another picture. Little things like that, stuff Karen didn't think anyone noticed. But Jake did. Back to that moment on her porch. Karen stood there, arms crossed, smirking at him. "Go home, Jake," she said again, like he was an annoying bug she could shoo away. But Jake didn't move. He thought about his notebook, tucked safe in his bedroom drawer. He thought about those pictures on his phone. And he thought about all the times she'd pushed him and everyone else around. Karen thought she was untouchable. She thought she could tow his truck and get away with it, just because she was the HOA president. Oh, how wrong she was. Jake straightened up, his fists unclenching a little. "You think you're so smart," he said, keeping his voice steady. "You think you can do whatever you want. But you're not the only one with rules, Karen." Her smirk faded, just a tiny bit. She tilted her head again, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice not so sassy now. Jake didn't answer, not yet. He just gave her a little smile of his own. Not a smug one like hers, but a quiet one. A smart one. Then he turned around and walked away, leaving her standing there wondering what he meant. As he walked back to his house, his mind was buzzing. He wasn't just mad anymore, he was planning. All those months of being quiet, of saying sure, Karen, had led to this. He'd watched her boss people around, heard the neighbors complain, and kept track of every little thing. Now it was time to use it. Days had turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and Karen's mean streak just got worse. She'd find people, yelled at them, and now she'd towed his truck. But every time she did something, Jake was there, writing it down, taking pictures, waiting. Little did she know, every step she took was digging her into a bigger hole. When he got home, he didn't stop moving. He ran to his bedroom, yanked open the drawer, and pulled out that notebook. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning his scribbly handwriting. There it was, all of it. Every complaint, every nasty word, every time she'd banged on his door. He grabbed his phone next and scrolled through the pictures. The SUV parked wrong, yep, still there. The trash cans out late, yep, that too. He even had a blurry shot of her yelling at Mr. Thompson one day, her face all red and mad. "This is it," Jake said to himself. "This is how I get her." But he wasn't ready to show it all yet. Not quite. He needed more. He sat on his bed, the notebook in his lap, and thought hard. Karen said he broke Rule 47B, right? Unsightly vehicles. But what if she broke a rule, too? What if towing his truck wasn't allowed? He remembered what his buddy Tom had said at work, those bylaws. Big rules the HOA had to follow. Maybe there was something in there about towing. Maybe Karen didn't have the right to take his truck from his own driveway. His heart beat faster. He didn't know the bylaws by heart, but he could find out. Jake grabbed his phone again and called Tom. It rang once, twice, then Tom picked up. "Hey, Jake," Tom said, his voice all cheerful. "What's up?" Jake didn't waste time. "Tom, You know those HOA bylaws you talked about? Can they tow my truck from my driveway just because it's old? Tom went quiet for a second, thinking. He said. They can't just tow stuff whenever they want. There's rules. Like, they might need a vote from the HOA board first. Or a warning. Did they warn you? Jake shook his head, even though Tom couldn't see. Nope. Just a note saying it's gone. Tom whistled. Whoa. That's shady. You should check the bylaws. I bet she messed up. Jake grinned. Thanks, Tom. I'll call you later. He hung up and jumped off the bed. This was a small revelation, a little crack in Karen's perfect plan. She thought she could tow his truck and hide behind her rulebook, but what if she broke the rules herself? What if Jake could prove it? He didn't have the bylaws yet, but he knew where to get them. The HOA sent out a booklet once a year. He had one somewhere in a pile of junk mail. He started digging through a drawer in the kitchen, tossing old letters and pizza coupons aside. While he searched, he kept thinking. Karen's smug face on the porch. Her laugh. Her "I'm the president" nonsense. She thought she was winning, but Jake was building something. Every note in his book, every picture on his phone, every little hint from Tom, it was all coming together. She'd pushed him too far, and now he was pushing back. Quietly. Smartly. And soon, she'd see she wasn't untouchable after all. He found the bylaws booklet under a stack of bills. Yes. He flipped it open, his fingers shaking a little. The words were tiny and boring, but he didn't care. He scanned the pages, looking for anything about towing. And there it was, in black and white: no vehicle may be removed from private property without prior notice and board approval. Jake's eyes went wide. No notice. No approval. Karen hadn't done any of that, she'd just towed it. He laughed out loud, a big, happy laugh. Gotcha, he said. This was just the start. The rising action was building, and Jake was ready for more. Karen didn't know it yet, but every move she'd made was bringing her closer to trouble. Jake had his notebook, his pictures, and now a rule she'd broken. What was he planning next? How was he going to use all this? Let's find out. Keep watching, because it's about to get even better. Jake stood in his kitchen, holding the HOA bylaws booklet like it was a treasure map. His laugh echoed off the walls, loud and happy, because he'd just found gold. No vehicle may be removed from private property without prior notice and board approval. That's what it said, right there on the page in tiny black letters. Jake read it again, just to be sure. Yep, still there. No notice. No approval. Karen had towed his truck without doing either of those things. She'd broken her own rules. Jake's grin grew so big it hurt his cheeks. Oh, Karen, he said to himself, you're in trouble now. He slapped the booklet down on the counter and started pacing again, his socks sliding on the floor. His mind was racing like a car in a race. Vroom, vroom. He had the bylaws. He had his notebook full of notes. He had pictures on his phone. And now he had proof that Karen messed up. This wasn't just about getting his truck back anymore. Nope, this was about showing Karen she couldn't boss everyone around and get away with it. Jake wasn't just mad, he was ready. Ready to fight. Ready to win. He stopped pacing and grabbed the notebook off the bed where he'd left it. He flipped it open again, his fingers moving fast. All those months of writing stuff down were paying off. He ran his eyes over the pages, reading his messy handwriting. June 20, Karen said truck is too loud. August 15, Karen fined Mrs. Lopez for dog barking. September 3, Karen yelled at Mr. Thompson about his bike. Every little thing she'd done, every mean word she'd said, it was all there. Jake tapped the page with his finger and nodded. You thought I'd forget, he mumbled. But I didn't. Then he picked up his phone and scrolled through the pictures again. There was the one of Karen's SUV parked all wrong, taking up 2 spots. Click proof she broke Rule 22C. There was the trash cans out late, breaking Rule 19A. Click another mistake. And that blurry one of her yelling at Mr. Thompson, her face all red and mad. Jake chuckled. You're not so perfect, are you, he said, talking to the picture like Karen could hear him. He had a whole pile of stuff now: notes, pictures, and that bylaws rule. It was like a puzzle, and he was putting the pieces together, one by one. But Jake knew he couldn't just run back to Karen's house and wave all this in her face. Not yet. She'd laugh at him again, or slam the door, or say something mean like, "You can't touch me, Jake." He had to be smart about this. Sneaky. He sat down on his couch, the old springs creaking under him, and thought hard. "Okay," he said out loud. "What's my next move?" He tapped his chin with his finger, like a detective in a movie. He had the proof, but he needed a plan. A way to use it. A way to make Karen see she'd picked the wrong fight. That's when he remembered something else. The neighbors. All those people Karen had bossed around, they weren't happy either. Jake wasn't the only one she'd fined or yelled at. Maybe they'd help him. Maybe they had stories, too. He leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling, and started thinking about the street. Mr. Thompson with his bike. Mrs. Lopez with her flowers and her dog. Even little Timmy down the road. Karen had fined his mom once because his soccer ball rolled into the street. Litter, she'd called it. Jake snorted. A soccer ball wasn't litter, but Karen didn't care. He jumped up and grabbed a pencil from the kitchen counter. "Time to talk to them," he said. He opened his notebook to a new page and wrote at the top, "Neighbors." Then he started a list. Mr. Thompson bike fine. Mrs. Lopez flowers and dog. Timmy's mom soccer ball. He tapped the pencil against his lips, thinking. Who else? Oh, there was old man Pete, who lived at the corner. Karen had yelled at him last month because his mailbox was a little crooked after a storm. "Fix it," she'd said, even though Pete was old and couldn't lift heavy stuff. Jake wrote that down, too. Pete mailbox. The list got longer as he thought about it. Every name was someone Karen had bugged. Every name was a little piece of the puzzle. Jake didn't know if they'd all help him, but he figured some of them might. They were tired of her, too. He'd seen it in their faces, the way they rolled their eyes when she walked by, the way they whispered to each other after she left. "She's crazy," they'd say. "She's too bossy." Jake had heard it all, and now he was going to use it. He decided to start with Mrs. Lopez. She lived next door, and she was nice. She'd even brought Jake cookies once, just because. He pulled on a hoodie, his favorite green one with a hole in the pocket, and stepped outside. The sun was high now, warming up the street. A couple of kids were riding bikes down the road, laughing. Jake waved at them, then turned to Mrs. Lopez's house. Her little dog, Max, was barking behind the fence, his fluffy tail wagging. Jake smiled. Max was loud, but he was cute. No wonder Karen hated him. He knocked on her door softly, not like Karen's loud bangs. Mrs. Lopez opened it a minute later, wiping her hands on a towel. She was short, with gray hair tied back in a bun, and she smiled when she saw him. "Jake," she said. "What's up?" Jake shuffled his feet a little, feeling shy. "Hey, Mrs. Lopez," he said. "Can I ask you something?" "About Karen." Her smile faded, and she rolled her eyes. "Oh, that woman," she said. "What did she do now?" "She towed my truck," Jake said, pointing at his empty driveway. Mrs. Lopez's eyes went wide. "She what?" she said, stepping outside. "Your truck? From your own house?" Jake nodded. "Yep. Last night. Left a note saying it's against the rules." Mrs. Lopez shook her head, her bun bouncing a little. "That's ridiculous," she said. "She's out of control." Jake nodded again. "Yeah. And I'm gonna do something about it." "Has she ever bugged you?" Mrs. Lopez laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. "Bugged me? Oh, honey, she's been on my case forever. Fined me for my flowers, said they were too wild. Fined me for Max barking, said he's a nuisance. He's a dog. Dogs bark." She threw her hands up, and Max barked from the yard like he agreed. Jake grinned. "Did she ever warn you first?" he asked. Mrs. Lopez thought for a second. "Nope," she said. "Just fines in the mail. No warnings." Jake's grin got bigger. "Thanks, Mrs. Lopez," he said. "That helps a lot." She tilted her head. "What are you planning, Jake?" He winked. "You'll see." He walked back home, feeling good. Mrs. Lopez was on his side, or at least, she hated Karen, 2. That was a start. He added to his notebook, Mrs. Lopez, no warnings for fines. Another little revelation. Karen wasn't just breaking rules with him, she was doing it to everyone. No warnings, no fair chances, just fines and yelling. Jake's plan was growing, piece by piece. He decided to talk to Mr. Thompson next. Mr. Thompson was outside, watering his roses like always. He was old, with a big hat to keep the sun off his face. Jake waved. "Hey, Mr. Thompson," he called. Mr. Thompson looked up and smiled. "Hey, Jake. Nice day, huh?" Jake nodded. "Yeah. Can I ask you something?" "About Karen." Mr. Thompson's smile dropped. "What did she do?" he asked, turning off the hose. "Towed my truck," Jake said. Mr. Thompson's eyebrows shot up. "No kidding," he said. "That's low, even for her. Has she ever fined you?" Jake asked. Mr. Thompson nodded. "Yep. $10 for leaving my bike out one night. Said it was clutter. No warning, just a fine in my mailbox." Jake's heart jumped. "Another one." "Thanks, Mr. Thompson," he said. "I'm working on something. I'll let you know." Mr. Thompson chuckled. "Give her heck, kid," he said. Jake laughed and headed home, writing in his notebook, "Mr. Thompson, no warning for bike fine." The day went on like that. Jake talked to Timmy's mom. "Yep, fined for the soccer ball, no warning." He talked to old man Pete. "Fined for the crooked mailbox, no warning either." Every neighbor had a story, and every story was the same, Karen bossing them around, breaking her own rules. Jake's notebook was filling up, and his phone was buzzing with ideas. He even snapped a new picture. Karen's SUV was still parked wrong that afternoon. Click. More proof. By the time the sun started setting, Jake was back on his couch, notebook open, bylaws beside him. He'd talked to half the street, and they were all mad at Karen. He had notes, pictures, and that big bylaws rule she'd broken. Things were heating up. Karen thought she was safe, sitting in her fancy house, but Jake was building a case. Every little talk, every revelation, was bringing him closer to a showdown. She didn't know it yet, but her smug days were numbered. What was Jake going to do with all this? How was he going to use it? Keep watching, we're just getting to the good part. Monday morning came fast. The weekend had been wild for Jake, finding rules, talking to neighbors, and building his plan. Now it was time to make it all happen. The neighborhood woke up to a big surprise, an emergency HOA meeting. Yep, out of nowhere, a note had gone around late Sunday night, taped to everyone's mailbox. Meeting Monday 10 a.m., at the community center. Be there. No one knew who called it at first, but Jake did. He'd snuck out after dark with Mrs. Lopez's help. She'd typed the notes and stuck them everywhere. He didn't sign his name, though. He wanted it to be a surprise. A big one. The community center was just a little building at the end of the street. It had a big room with folding chairs, a table up front, and a few old posters on the walls. Usually, it was quiet, maybe a book club or a kids' party once in a while. But not today. Today, it was packed. Neighbors shuffled in, yawning and sipping coffee, wondering why they were there. Mr. Thompson was in his big hat, Mrs. Lopez had Max on a leash outside, and even old man Pete hobbled in with his cane. Timmy's mom showed up, too, whispering to someone about Karen. Everyone was curious, and a little grumpy. It was Monday, after all. Up front stood HOA Karen. She was all dressed up, like she was going to a fancy party. Her sunglasses were perched on her head, her hair was pulled back tight, and she held her precious rulebook in her hands. She looked proud, like a peacock strutting around. Jake's truck was gone, towed away on her orders, and she thought everyone would cheer for her. "Good morning," she said, her voice loud and fake cheerful. "Thanks for coming. I called this meeting to talk about some rule breakers." She smirked, glancing around the room. "We've had some problems lately, like ugly vehicles cluttering up our perfect neighborhood. I took care of it, and I know you'll all support me." The room was quiet at first. A few people shifted in their seats, not sure what to say. Karen kept talking, flipping through her rulebook. "Rule 47B says no unsightly vehicles. That rusty truck in Jake Miller's driveway? Gone now. You're welcome. She smiled big, expecting claps or nods. But no one clapped. Mr. Thompson coughed. Mrs. Lopez rolled her eyes so hard Jake could see it from the back. Karen didn't notice, she was too busy patting herself on the back. She thought she'd won. She thought this meeting was her big moment to shine. Oh, how wrong she was. That's when the door creaked open. Everyone turned to look, and in walked Jake. He wasn't stomping or yelling like he'd done at Karen's house. Nope, he was calm as could be. His sneakers were tied this time, his green hoodie zipped up, and he had a stack of papers tucked under his arm. In his other hand, he held his phone, and on his face? A big OL grin. Not a mad grin, not a scared one, just a happy, confident grin, like he knew something no one else did. He strolled right down the middle of the room, past all the chairs, while people whispered. "What's he doing?" Timmy's mom said. "Is that Jake?" Old man Pete mumbled. Karen's eyes narrowed, but she kept her smirk. The room went quiet, super quiet. You could hear Max barking faintly outside, but inside, it was like everyone held their breath. Jake stopped a few feet from Karen, right in front of the table. He set his papers down, thump, and looked straight at her. "Karen," he said, loud and clear so everyone could hear, "you towed my truck. Took it right from my driveway. But did you know you just broke the law?" Karen's face froze. Her smirk didn't drop right away, it just stuck there, like it was glued on. Her eyes got wide, and her hands gripped the rulebook tighter. "What?" she said, her voice squeaking. "What are you talking about?" The neighbors leaned forward in their chairs, eyes bouncing between Jake and Karen. Jake didn't flinch. He picked up the bylaws booklet from his stack of papers and held it up high. "I checked the HOA bylaws," he said, tapping the cover. "Turns out, you can't tow someone's car from their own property without a vote from the board." And guess what? There was no vote. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Little oohs and ahs popped up everywhere. Mrs. Lopez clapped her hands once, loud, and said, "Ha." Mr. Thompson nodded, his hat bobbing. Timmy's mom whispered, "No vote," to the lady next to her. Karen's smirk finally fell off, and her mouth opened like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Jake kept going. He flipped open the bylaws and read out loud, slow and clear. Page 12, Section 3, no vehicle may be removed from private property without prior notice and board approval. You didn't tell me first, Karen. And you didn't ask the board. You just did it. The room buzzed now. People started talking all at once, their voices mixing together. "She didn't ask us," someone said. "I'm on the board, she never called me," said a guy in a red shirt. Karen's face turned pink, then red. She waved her rulebook like it could save her. "That's not true," she said, her voice loud again. "I'm the president. I can enforce the rules." "Rule 47B says," Jake cut her off. "Rule 47B doesn't say you can tow my truck without a vote," he said, calm but firm. "You broke the big rules, Karen. Not me." Then came the big drop, the bomb that made everyone's jaw hit the floor. Jake held up his phone, turning it so the whole room could see the screen. "And that's not all," he said. He swiped to a picture, click, and there it was, Karen's fancy SUV, parked across two spots in her driveway. "This is your car, right?" he asked, showing it off. "Parked all wrong. Rule 22C says cars have to be neat, one per spot. You broke that rule yourself." The crowd gasped again, louder this time. Mrs. Lopez laughed out loud, and Mr. Thompson clapped his hands. "She's a hypocrite," someone yelled from the back. Karen's face went from red to white. That's not the same," she stammered, pointing at the phone. "That's my driveway. I can." Jake didn't let her finish. He swiped to another picture, click, her trash cans out late. "And this," he said. "Rule 19A says trash cans go in by 7 a.m. This was taken at noon. Another rule you broke." The neighbors were buzzing now, some laughing, some shaking their heads. Karen looked around, her eyes darting, like she wanted to run away. But Jake wasn't done. He dropped the biggest bomb yet. "Oh, and I called the city," he said, his grin getting wider. "They told me you need a permit to tow anything around here. A special paper from the city hall. Did you get one, Karen? He paused, letting it sink in. Nope. You didn't. And guess what? That's a $500 fine, for you. The room exploded. Claps, cheers, and whoa-s filled the air. Karen's jaw hit the floor literally, her mouth hung open so wide you could see her teeth. Her rulebook slipped from her hands and fell thud, onto the table. She didn't pick it up. She just stood there, frozen, while the neighbors went wild. Mrs. Lopez jumped up, clapping like she was at a party. You tell her, Jake, she shouted. Mr. Thompson banged his cane on the floor thump, thump, and yelled, that's right. Even old man Pete, who never said much, chuckled and said, well, I'll be. Jake stood tall, his papers in one hand, his phone in the other. He didn't yell or dance around, he just smiled. Calm, cool, and happy. He'd caught her red-handed, and everyone saw it. Karen tried to talk. This is ridiculous, she sputtered. I'm the president. You can't, but no one listened. The guy in the red shirt, his name was Dave, and he was on the HOA board, stood up. Karen, he said, you didn't tell the board about this too. You broke the rules. We're done with this. The clapping got louder. Karen looked around, her face all sweaty now, her sunglasses sliding down her forehead. She'd been so proud when she started the meeting, thinking everyone would back her towing stunt. Now she was stuck, with Jake's proof shining bright for all to see. He turned it all around. She thought he was just some quiet guy with a rusty truck, but he'd been watching, waiting, and now bam, he'd hit her with the truth. Let's back up a tiny bit so you can see how awesome this moment was. All weekend, Jake had been busy. After talking to Mrs. Lopez and Mr. Thompson and all the others, he'd stayed up late, reading the bylaws, checking his notes, making sure everything was perfect. He'd called the city on Sunday, talked to a nice lady at the desk, and asked about towing rules. Yep, she'd said, you need a permit. No permit, no tow. And that's a $500 fine if you mess it up. Jake had written that down, too, in big letters, $500 fine. He'd planned this meeting with Mrs. Lopez, kept it secret, and walked in ready to drop every single bomb he had. And it worked. Karen's smug grin was gone. Her rulebook couldn't save her. The neighbors weren't on her side, they were clapping for Jake. He'd shown them the bylaws, the pictures, the city rules. He'd shown them Karen wasn't untouchable. She'd towed his truck thinking she'd win, but every little thing he'd collected, every note, every photo, every neighbor's story had built up to this. The big reveal. The moment she realized she'd lost, Karen stumbled back a step, her hands shaking. This isn't fair, she said, her voice all high and whiny. I was just trying to help the neighborhood. But the crowd didn't buy it. You helped yourself. Mrs. Lopez yelled. You find my dog. And my bike. Mr. Thompson added. Jake didn't say anything, he didn't need to. The room was doing it for him. He just stood there, grinning, while Karen's perfect little world fell apart. The guy in the red shirt, Dave, raised his hand. Okay, everyone, quiet down, he said. The noise slowed, but the excitement didn't. I'm on the board, Dave went on, and I say we vote right now. Should Karen stay president after this? Hands shot up everywhere, almost every single one for no. Karen's eyes got huge. You can't do that, she shouted. Dave shrugged. We just did. You're out, Karen. The cheers came back, louder than ever. Jake's grin turned into a full laugh now, a happy one that made his whole face light up. Karen grabbed her rulebook and stormed toward the door, her shoes clicking fast on the floor. This isn't over, she yelled, but no one cared. She'd been caught, and Jake had done it. How's that for a twist? The community center was still buzzing after Jake's big reveal. Karen stood there, her rulebook hugged tight to her chest, her face all red and sweaty. She looked like a kid who'd just gotten caught sneaking cookies, not so smug anymore. The neighbors were clapping and cheering for Jake, and the HOA board guy, Dave, had just said, You're out, Karen. She didn't like that, not one bit. She opened her mouth and tried to talk her way out of it. Wait, she said, her voice all high and shaky. This isn't fair. I was just doing my job. I made the neighborhood better. But it was too late. Way too late. Nobody believed her excuses. The crowd didn't even quiet down, they just kept talking and laughing over her. Mrs. Lopez shouted, "Better for who? Not my dog." Mr. Thompson banged his cane on the floor and said, "You find my bike." Even little Timmy's mom chimed in, "My son's soccer ball wasn't hurting anybody." Karen's eyes darted around, looking for anyone to agree with her. But all she saw were mad faces and big grins for Jake. Her words didn't work this time. The HOA board was fed up with her nonsense, and they weren't waiting around. Dave, the guy in the red shirt, stepped up again. "Okay, Karen," he said, loud so everyone could hear. "You broke the rules. You towed Jake's truck without a vote. You didn't have a permit. And you've been bossing us around for too long. We're done." He turned to the other board people sitting at the table, 2 ladies and an old guy with glasses. "Board, what do you say? Should Karen stay president?" The lady with curly hair shook her head fast. "Nope," she said. The old guy with glasses said, "No way." The other lady just laughed and said, "Out." Dave nodded. "That's it, then. You're voted out, right now." Karen's jaw dropped again like it had when Jake showed the pictures. "You can't do this," she yelled, stomping her foot. "I'm the president. I make the rules." But Dave just shrugged. "Not anymore," he said. "The board decides, and we say you're gone. Bye, Karen." The room exploded with claps and cheers again. Mrs. Lopez whooped, "Yes," and Mr. Thompson clapped his hands so hard his hat almost fell off. Karen looked around, her face getting redder, her hands shaking. She grabbed her rulebook tighter, spun around, and stormed out the door. Her shoes went click 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 on the floor, fast and mad, until she was gone. Jake stood there, still holding his papers and phone, grinning like it was his birthday. The neighbors crowded around him, patting his back, shaking his hand. "Way to go, Jake," Mrs. Lopez said, her eyes all bright. "You showed her." Mr. Thompson nodded. "Good job, kid. She had it coming." Even old man Pete hobbled over and said, "Never liked her anyway." Jake laughed, his voice mixing with all the happy noise. "Thanks, everybody," he said. "I just wanted my truck back." But it was more than that. Now he'd done something big, and everyone knew it. Let's talk about that truck for a minute. After the meeting, Jake didn't waste any time. He pulled out his phone and called the towing company, the one Karen had hired to take his truck away. The guy who answered sounded grumpy at first. "Yeah, what?" he said. Jake kept it simple. "You towed my truck Friday night. Blue pickup, from my driveway. HOA Karen told you to do it?" The guy grunted. "Yep, we got it. What's the problem?" Jake smiled, even though the guy couldn't see. "The problem," he said, "is she broke the rules. HOA bylaws say you can't tow from private property without a vote. There was no vote. And the city says you need a permit. She didn't have one. So I want my truck back now." The towing guy went quiet for a second. Hold on," he said. Jake could hear him typing on a computer, then muttering to someone else. Finally, he came back. "Okay, look," he said, his voice softer now. "We didn't know about that. She said it was all legit. If she didn't have a permit, that's on her. We'll bring your truck back, no charge. Sorry about this, man." Jake's grin got bigger. "Thanks," he said. "Bring it today." The guy promised they would, and Jake hung up, feeling like a champ. By that afternoon, the tow truck rolled back into the neighborhood. Not sneaking this time, loud and proud, rumbling down the street. Jake stood on his porch, watching as they pulled up. There it was, his beat-up blue pickup, dents and all, looking just like it always did. The driver hopped out, unhooked it, and parked it right in Jake's driveway. "Here you go," he said, scratching his head. "No fee. We messed up, following her orders. Won't happen again." Jake nodded. "No problem," he said. "Just glad it's back." The driver waved and drove off, leaving Jake with his truck, safe and sound. He walked over and patted the hood, like it was an old friend. "Missed you," he said, laughing a little. The sun was shining bright, making the chipped paint sparkle. It wasn't fancy, sure, but it was his. He climbed in, turned the key, and the engine roared to life, rumble, rumble. Just like always. He drove it around the block once, just for fun, then parked it right back in the driveway where it belonged. Every time he looked at it, he felt good. Karen had tried to take it, but she'd failed. Justice was served, and it felt awesome. Word spread fast after that meeting. By lunchtime, everyone on the street knew what happened. Neighbors who hadn't come, like the ones who slept in or had work, heard it from Mrs. Lopez or Timmy's mom. Jake took down Karen, they'd say. She's not president anymore. People started talking more, not just whispering like before. They'd stand in their yards or chat over fences, sharing their own Karen stories. She fined me for my porch light being too bright, one guy said. She told me my grass was too short, said another lady. Everyone had something, and now they weren't afraid to say it out loud. Mrs. Lopez stopped by Jake's house that afternoon with a plate of cookies. For you, she said, smiling. You're a hero, Jake. He took the cookies' chocolate chip, warm and gooey, and laughed. I'm not a hero, he said. I just wanted my truck. She shook her head. No, you did more than that. You stopped her. We're all free now. Jake munched a cookie and shrugged, but deep down, he knew she was right. The neighborhood felt different, lighter, happier, like a big weight was gone. Mr. Thompson came by later, too. He tipped his hat and said, You did good, kid. She's been a pain forever. Now she's quiet. Jake grinned. Hope so, he said. Even little Timmy ran up, kicking his soccer ball. Thanks, Jake, he yelled. She can't find my ball anymore. Jake waved. Kick it all you want, Timmy. The kid laughed and ran off, the ball bouncing down the street. And Karen? She was nowhere to be seen. Her fancy house stayed quiet all day. No clipboard, no stomping around, no yelling. Jake peeked out his window once and saw her SUV still there, parked right, this time not across two spots. He chuckled. Guess she learned something, he said to himself. Word was, she'd packed up her stuff, her rulebook, her sunglasses, all of it, and stayed inside. Probably too embarrassed to show her face. The queen she thought she was? Gone. Faded away like a bad dream. Days turned into weeks, and the street kept feeling better. The HOA board picked a new president, Dave, the guy in the red shirt. He was chill, not bossy. No more silly fines, he said at the next meeting. Let's just keep things nice and easy. Everyone clapped for that. Jake's truck stayed in his driveway, rusty and loud, and nobody complained. People started fixing up their yards how they wanted. Mrs. Lopez planted wildflowers again, and Max barked all he liked. Mr. Thompson left his bike out sometimes, just because he could. Timmy kicked his ball everywhere, and Old Man Pete didn't bother with his crooked mailbox. It was free, like the neighborhood could breathe again. Jake loved it. Every morning, he'd step outside, sip his coffee, and look at his truck shining in the sun. It wasn't perfect, but it was his, and no one could take it now. Neighbors driving by would slow down and wave little friendly waves, like he was their buddy. Hey, Jake, they'd call. He'd wave back, smiling. They didn't say it out loud, but he knew what they meant. He was the guy who'd slayed the dragon, the Karen dragon, and they liked him for it. One day, he sat on his porch in that squeaky rocking chair, eating one of Mrs. Lopez's cookies. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. Kids were laughing down the street, and a bird chirped in a tree. Jake leaned back, the chair creaking, and looked at his truck. Pretty cool, huh, he said to himself. It was more than cool, it was perfect. He'd fought back, won, and made things right. Not just for him, but for everybody. Karen. She didn't come back. Some said she might move away, too ashamed to stay. Others said she'd just hide forever. Either way, she wasn't the boss anymore. Her clipboard days were over, and Jake's truck days were just fine. The neighborhood was happy, and justice was served big time. Okay, let's sit back and think about this story for a minute. It's been a wild ride, right? Jake and his truck, HOA Karen with her clipboard, all that yelling and towing and big surprises. But now that it's over, there's something cool we can learn from it. Something big. So here's the thing, sometimes the loudest person thinks they're in charge, but it's the quiet ones who change everything. Yeah, that's right, quiet people like Jake can be the real heroes. Let's talk about why that's so awesome and what it means for you and me. Picture this. When we first met Karen, she was loud, like, super loud. She'd stomp around the neighborhood, banging on doors, yelling about rules, waving her rulebook like it was a magic wand. Fix your truck, she'd shout at Jake. Your flowers are wrong, she'd tell Mrs. Lopez. Your bike's a mess, she'd snap at Mr. Thompson. Her voice was sharp, and she made sure everyone heard it. She thought being loud meant she was the boss. She thought it made her big and important, like a queen on a throne. And for a while, it worked. People listened, or at least, they didn't fight back. They'd grumble, roll their eyes, and do what she said just to make her go away. Karen loved that. She loved walking down the street with her clipboard, her sunglasses perched on her head, acting like she owned everything. She thought nobody could stop her. Why? Because she was loud, and loud people get noticed. She'd tow Jake's truck, find Timmy's soccer ball, boss old man Pete about his mailbox, all because she could shout and make a fuss. In her mind, that made her the winner. She didn't care if people liked her. She just wanted them to do what she said. Loud, 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 that was her power. But then there was Jake. Quiet Jake. He wasn't loud at all. He didn't stomp around or yell at people. When Karen banged on his door, he'd just smile soft and calm and say, "Sure, Karen," then close the door. He didn't argue. He didn't scream back. He didn't even look mad most of the time. He'd go inside, sit on his creaky couch, and sip his soda like nothing happened. To Karen, that made him weak. She thought, oh, Jake's just some guy. He won't do anything. I can push him around. She thought quiet meant scared or lazy. Boy, was she wrong. See, Jake wasn't weak. He was smart. He didn't yell or fight dirty, he paid attention. All those months Karen was being loud, Jake was watching. Listening. Writing stuff down in his little notebook. Karen said this, he'd write. Karen did that. He took pictures with his phone, click, click, of her SUV parked wrong, her trash cans out late. He talked to neighbors, heard their stories, and kept it all in his head. He didn't make a big show of it. He didn't run around shouting, "I'm gonna get her." Nope. He stayed quiet, sneaky, and patient, like a cat waiting to pounce. And when the time was right, bam! He pounced. That emergency meeting was his moment. He walked in, calm as could be, with his papers and his grin, and he took Karen down. Not with yelling or punching or anything loud. He used the truth. He showed the bylaws rules she broke. He showed the pictures proof she wasn't perfect. He told everyone about the city permit she didn't have. Quiet Jake didn't need to shout. The truth was loud enough. And when he dropped those bombs, the whole room cheered for him, not her. Karen's loud voice didn't win. Jake's quiet smarts did. So here's the cool part, sometimes the quiet ones change everything. Karen thought she was in charge because she made noise, but Jake proved you don't need to be loud to be strong. He didn't fight her with fists or mean words. He fought her with facts. He stood up when it counted, not just for his truck, but for everybody. Mrs. Lopez got her flowers back. Mr. Thompson kept his bike out. Timmy kicked his soccer ball. Old man Pete didn't fix his mailbox. The whole neighborhood got freer because Jake, the quiet guy, paid attention and did something about it. Maybe there's a lesson here for all of us. Think about it. Have you ever met a loud person who thinks they're the boss? Maybe at school, there's a kid who yells a lot, telling everyone what to do. Sit here, they say. Play my game. Or maybe there's a grown-up like a teacher or a coach who's always loud and bossy, thinking that makes them right. Loud people can seem big and scary, like they're in control. But what about the quiet ones? The kids who don't talk much, who watch and listen instead. They might not shout, but they see things. They hear things. And when it's time, they can do something big just like Jake. Let's imagine you for a second. Say there's a Karen in your life. Not an HOA Karen, maybe, but someone bossy. Like a kid at recess who says, "You can't play with us unless you do what I say." They're loud, and they push you around. You could yell back, sure. You could stomp your feet and say, no way. But what if you try Jake's way? What if you stayed quiet, watched them, and figured out how to fix it smart? Maybe you notice they break a rule like taking 2 turns when they're only supposed to take 1. Maybe you tell a teacher, calm and clear, with proof. No yelling, just truth. That could work, right? Or think about home. Maybe you've got a brother or sister who's loud, always shouting, my toy, or my show on TV. They think they're in charge because they're noisy. But you could be the quiet one who waits, watches, and finds a way to win. Like, you share your toy first, and then they feel silly for not sharing back. Or you talk to your mom, nice and soft, and say, they've had the TV all day, can I have a turn? Quiet doesn't mean weak. Quiet can mean clever. Quiet can mean strong. Jake showed us that. He didn't let Karen run his life. She towed his truck, sure, but he didn't just cry or give up. He stood up when it counted. He used his brain, his notebook, his phone, stuff he had all along. He didn't need to be loud to beat her. He just needed to be ready. And when he was ready, he won, not just for him, but for everyone. That's the lesson, I think. Stand up when it matters, and don't let a loud Karen push you around. You don't have to shout to do it. You just have to be you, smart, brave, and true. Let's picture Jake one more time. After Karen was gone, he'd sit on his porch, rocking in that squeaky chair, looking at his truck. The sun would shine, the birds would chirp, and the street would feel happy. Neighbors waved at him, like he was their buddy. He didn't brag or act big. He just smiled, ate his cookies from Mrs. Lopez, and thought, I did that. He changed everything, and he did it his way, quiet and steady. That's pretty inspiring, huh? So what do you think? Could you take down an HOA Karen? Not a real Karen, maybe, but a bossy person in your world? I bet you could. You don't need a truck or a rule book. You've got your eyes, your ears, your brain, stuff Jake used, stuff you have too. Maybe there's a time you've already done it, stood up quiet and smart, and won. Like when you helped a friend who was picked on, or figured out a problem nobody else could. Or maybe there's a time coming, a chance to be the quiet hero. What would you do? How would you do it? Let's play a little game. Imagine you're Jake, but at school. There's a loud kid, let's call her Bossy Bella. She's always telling everyone, my rules. You can't sit here. You can't play that. She thinks she's the queen of recess. What would you do? Would you watch her, like Jake watched Karen? Would you write down what she does, maybe how she hogs the swings or takes extra snacks? Would you tell a teacher, calm and clear, with proof? Or would you get your friends together, like Jake got the neighbors, and say, we're done with this? You could be quiet but strong, just like him. Or think bigger. Maybe there's a Karen in your town. Like a grown-up who's always loud about silly stuff, telling kids not to ride bikes or saying the park's too noisy. Could you be the Jake who fixes it? Maybe you'd listen, learn the rules, and find a way to show they're wrong. Not with yelling, but with smarts. You could change things, make them better, and everyone would thank you just like they thanked Jake. That's the neat thing about this story. It's not just about a truck or a mean lady. It's about us. About how we can be strong, even if we're not loud. About how we can stand up, even if we're shy. Jake didn't need to be a superhero with a cape. He was just a guy with a notebook and a plan. And he won. So maybe we can win, too. Maybe the next time a loud person tries to run our lives, we can say, nope, and do it our way, quiet, smart, and brave. So here's my question for you, could you take down an HOA Karen? Could you be the quiet one who changes everything? I think you could. I think you've got it in you, smarts, heart, all of it. Tell me below, what do you think? Have you ever beaten a bossy person? Or would you try Jake's way next time? Drop it in the comments, I want to hear your stories. Jake's story is done, but yours? Yours is just starting. Go be awesome, okay?